So somebody asked me, how do you know which scale to pick for a dominant chord? There are so many options of scales, so how do you know which one works where? And I talked in a previous segment about how you need to understand what secondary dominants are, and you might want to look at that if you don't know your secondary dominants. But most of all, you need to know if you're in a major or minor tonality, because those two different situations create different dominant scales. So let's look at the scales that we have and let's see what kind of chord they create. If you stack the notes as a chord, you will get different extensions depending on which scale. But first of all, you need to know, you need to understand the situation you're playing in. If you're playing, let's say, with a singer, you want to be aware of what the notes in the melody are, because you don't want to play an extension that clashes with the note in the melody. So, or if you play with anybody who's playing the melody, obviously. So usually the melody dictates which extensions that work. Also, if you're playing in an orchestra or a big band, the extensions are written out there because those are the extensions that the horns or the strings or whatever are playing. So if you don't pay attention to those extensions and respect them, you're going to clash with what everybody else is playing. Whereas if you're playing, let's say, in a jam session with really, great musicians, they usually treat the standard with a lot of freedom. They can come up with different extensions on the spot, and you need to be able to pick up with your ears what the piano player is doing. It's something you develop over the years. You recognize different dominant chords. So then you have more flexibility to change the extensions and be more or less progressive, I guess. But let's just look at the scales and the basics first. So let's say we're in major. You have a regular dominant chord, which is let's say in C major, the dominant chord would be G, G7 or G13 if you stack the extensions. Or it could be a sus chord. When jazz musicians talk about sus chords, they talk about an F major 7 over G. Or if you play it as a 13 chord, it's a one note different. A little bit different than the way classical musicians think about sus chords. So I'll play a little vamp with my loop pedal that I just purchased, and C major 7 to G sus 13, and we'll see what scale we can play over that. So obviously the scale is Mixolydian. Or bebop scale. Mixolydian bebop scale. Okay, so that's not, it's pretty straightforward. I think most of you know those scales. Let's say there's a sharp 11 in there. A 13 sharp 11 chord. Then you have the Lydian flat 7 scale. Some people call it other things. I call it Lydian flat 7. So let's try that one. Okay, moving on. There's one scale that almost nobody talks about it, which is the harmonic major. I've talked about that in the previous lesson as well, so you can go back and look at my lesson on harmonic major. If you play a C harmonic major, start on the G, you get a G Mixolydian flat 9 scale, I guess. I rarely see that mentioned, so why not? Let's see what it sounds like. Then we have the infamous altered scale. Now, this is a more outside jazz sound. So the extensions would be flat 9, flat 13, or sharp 5, depending on how you look at it. So if you see one of those, or it sometimes even says G7 altered, and then, you know, there's a no-brainer, you play the altered scale. So that's going to sound totally different. C major, G altered. So that scale works because it's such a strong dominant sound, and but it's a little bit edgy, so you want to be careful when you're using it, I think. Whole tone scale also works in major when you have a sharp 5 chord with a regular 9 in it. Then you use that scale, which is not very common, but it's totally an interesting option, I think. You can actually create a chord with the notes from the whole tone scale. So flat 5, flat 7, 3rd, sharp 5, 9th. That chord is the actual notes of the scale, so obviously the scale would be the whole tone. So I'm not going to play this chord now because it's tricky to do, but I'll play some kind of dominant and sharp 5, 9 chord. C major. It's fun to experiment with that scale. And finally, we have the symmetrical diminished scale, or half whole. So I have talked about this scale before and in previous lessons. And the chord symbol would be a 13 flat 9 chord, because you have the major 6 or 13 in there. Also, it could be a G13 sharp 9. So I have talked about that scale before, so you can find in my previous lessons a lot of information about that scale if you're not familiar with it. Interesting to note is that the altered scale and the Lydian flat 7 are the same scale. So if I'm in C major and I substitute the G with a D flat, and if I play a D flat Lydian flat 7, those are the same notes as G altered. So I'll do that and you can see what it sounds like. So C major, D flat, are the actual same scales. That's why I think of the Lydian flat 7, I don't usually think of that as a scale that I use over the regular dominant chord. It's something that I use over the substitute dominant chord, if that makes any sense. Or when you have like a static G7, a dominant 7/13 chord for a longer time, then I usually try to play that scale more than on a regular 2/5, if that makes any sense. There's also a scale that we never play, in which is the Mikko flat 13. It's weird. It's not very user-friendly for some reason. So you can make the argument that that's the scale we need to look at, but I'm gonna skip it for now. Maybe I'll come back to that in a previous or in a following lesson. Okay, now let's look at the dominant chords in minor. So if I'm in C minor instead, and I want to play the notes that are closest to C minor but works over a G7, I end up with a C harmonic minor scale starting on G, which is called dominant Phrygian or Phrygian dominant. I guess Phrygian dominant is the best word. And the extensions would be flat 9, flat 13. Okay, so I'll play that. So C minor. Bebop scale, same thing, you add the major 7. I've also talked about this before in a previous lesson on how to treat the dominant chord in blue bossa, so I'm kind of repeating the same things here a little bit. So major bebop scale starting on the 3rd degree, which would be an E flat major bebop scale starting on G. So you see it's very close to the previous scale we just played. It's just adding the flat 9, sorry, the sharp 9. If I leave out the C, I get 3rd mode of harmonic major. Then obviously I can use the altered scale. So the difference there is the flat 5, right? So if you see a chord symbol which says flat 9, sharp 9, flat 13, and flat 5, then altered would be the only scale options, I guess. You can also add natural 5 to the altered scale, which creates a kind of an interesting bebop scale. Then whole tone is questionable because you get the major third of the key. So I guess in some modern tunes you can see they want that. They want a minor chord and the dominant chord should be with a regular 13, but it's gonna stand out. It's gonna be kind of weird sounding. So the same goes with the symmetrical diminished. I think it sounds hip and cool if you use it with you have to be use your taste. So it could stand out too much. But if you do it in the right way, it can work. Another thing is that when you have the dominant chord for a longer time, like a static chord, like the tune Caravan, then you are you have the how should I say this? You can experiment more. I'll show you what I mean. So let's say we were playing Caravan. You can experiment. So the dominant Phrygian or Phrygian dominant would be the most obvious choice because that's what the melody is. But because it's so long, we can Mixolydian, or sorry, symmetrical diminished. And then when it's time to resolve, I get into the alter. Or whole tone. So I'll even Mixolydian maybe. Flat 7, right? Now we're getting closer, so I'll play that's the Lydian flat 7, whole tone. So you see what I'm doing there? I'm playing any dominant scale, even though it's in minor. The Mixolydian even works. I've heard Wes Montgomery do that, and it blew my mind when I heard that, because how can he play Mixolydian? The tune is in minor, but because it's lasting, it's happening for such a long time, it doesn't bother you when you're listening to it. And then when you get closer to the resolution, then you throw in the altered or the more minor sounding scales. So that's something you can think about. It's fun to experiment with, because that tune can easily get boring if you're playing the Phrygian dominant Phrygian, whatever it's called. Even though the melody suggests that, also the title of the tune and the lyrics suggest some kind of exotic sound, right? So it's easy to think that that's the only scale option you have, but you can actually play a lot of scales, all of them actually, over that tune. It's a perfect example of a tune to practice dominant chords over. So that was my dominant scale lesson. So I hope I didn't confuse you this time either. So I'll see you next time.